Akshat Rati, finally, we got you on the show.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Thanks for all your patience.
No, you're very kind to be able to make time for this. I'm so privileged, to be able to have these kind of conversations. And this will be our 50th episode.
Oh, fantastic.
So-
Congratulations.
Well, we splashed out. So we actually have working with the wonderful folks at Soho Sonic to use their studio.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump right in, and I want to start at the end. So in your last chapter in Climate Capitalism, you relay some stories of a central banker trying to reform the system and a leader of Extinction Rebellion. Why is that context important for how you define climate capitalism as opposed to a defense and apologia for an existing instantation, kind of extant version of capitalism?
Well, we don't know which theory of change is going to work because climate change and tackling it is going to require us to change a lot of things. And the theory of change that might succeed may depend on the political context. But what I wanted to do with the last chapter was to give people an idea that, look, here are all the ways and here are all the examples through which we have seen change happen, whether that's deployment of technologies like solar, wind, batteries, electric cars, or it is systemic levers being changed, laws, finance, shareholder activism. But if none of that happens, because climate change is not going away, we continue to pump out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we continue to warm the planet, that's going to cause more extreme weather events to happen. And that's going to cause people to want to have their voice heard. So if you don't change the system from the inside, which some people are trying and are trying to do it at many, many different places, well, then people from the outside would want to undo the system. And I feel like capitalism basically is on notice that if it doesn't fix itself, well, it will be fixed by somebody.
It's an interesting way of putting it. My granny used to put it that way and say she'd be fixing my wagon and then chase me around to her living room with a wooden spoon if I was being naughty. So one of the people that I've admired your conversations with, and it seems to have, and we talked a little bit in the green room before about climate fiction, isn't really kind of on your nightstand all that much, but Kim Stanley Robinson, one of my favorite authors going back to, his stuff in the 80s, and his view about why capitalism, we've only got 30 years to make some of these profound changes. This is the system we've got, and therefore the system must be adapted in some way. So I guess the question is that something that, just to answer critics who say, as talking to Amy Westervelt, she says hi, and she said, I always ask Akshat, why are you so in love with capitalism? But it feels like I know she knows this, but you're saying something slightly more nuanced than that. But this is the fact that we have this time limit, the real issue about why we can't simply magic up a different system.
Yeah. Well, it's not my love of capitalism. I'm a journalist. My goal is to try and understand the world as it is and to see how it can be changed for doing better for all the people around the world. Businesses do contribute to society and many businesses contribute positively. The problem that we are facing with climate is a very clear, specific one, which is that the cost of pollution from businesses has not been accounted for in their profits and their bottom line. We're not taxing them enough. We're not putting up enough regulations to ensure that they don't put all that cost just on society, bear some of it at least. And so that's the problem with business. This is not, so to speak, loving capitalism. It's to see, well, capitalism has its benefits, but it also clearly has its downsides. So how can you fix the downsides while keeping what is portion of it that is quite good?
Right. And I want to get back into some of the details in the book in 1 second, and I want to get there. But I also want to ask, so anytime you write a book or anything really at length, you're giving hostages to fortune, right? So you write a book at a certain time, and events afterwards sometimes prove you out or sometimes, kind of change the way things happen or seem. And you start and end the book with the very rational sentiment, it's cheaper to save the planet than destroy it, which suggests that people would therefore say, so therefore, let's save it, quite rationally. But since writing the book, We've had some events. We've had BP and Shell replacing CEOs and not just doing a U-turn, but suing activist shareholders. We've had governments, including here in the UK, suggesting that, or people around the government suggesting that Just Stop Oil activists should be treated as terrorists. We've had, people seeming to row back on policies. A raft of elections are happening that seem to put green policies in doubt. Are you still optimistic?
Well, my job as a journalist is not to be either pessimistic or optimistic, right? What I'm trying to figure out is, in the events that happen, do they point to a long-term thing? Are there forces that have changed from directions that I wrote in the book? And that's not true. So you can just list a whole number of, if you wanted to categorize the stories into two baskets. Pessimistic, which is the list you counted. I can give you a whole load of stories that are in the optimistic basket, right? I finished writing the book in 2022, right? It takes about a year to edit and get it out. That year was the first year when we spent more than $1 trillion on the energy transition. Last year, we spent $1.8 trillion, right? So already we are starting to accelerate the spend on clean energy. The other thing to notice is that in that period, if you look at what's happening at COPs, at these climate summits that happen every year, where all countries come together, commitments are being made that are higher, which means that the possible temperature outcome is starting to go lower and lower. So, I'm trying to do two things at the same time as a journalist. One is to keep an eye on the news and try and tell people what matters right now, but also as a journalist, thinking about a problem that is a decadal long problem and has to be solved at a decadal length. What are the long-term trends? And if anything, the thesis of the book has only become stronger, and I believe will continue to get stronger because this is the fundamental part of it. There are no profits on a planet that doesn't exist. And so it is in business interest, and that is what we've seen through economic analysis happening over the past 2 decades, that this system be fixed. The challenge isn't about whether businesses should solve or work to tackle climate change. It's how and who profits in the intervening period if we don't.
Absolutely. So now I want to jump back. And first I want to talk about your dad. Unlike a lot of these type of books, you're actually quick, make yourself a little bit personal, a little bit vulnerable. You're very generous in revealing some personal details, a little bit like your family. And you went to visit your dad for his 60th birthday and check out the house to see whether it be kind of useful to get solar panels on the roof, and then negotiating with the bureaucracy of the Discom, the distribution companies in India. But I actually want to ask, what was it like growing up in your family?
Yeah. Well, it's been fun. I mean, my dad's an engineer, mechanical engineer by background, but all his life, at least the life in which I've understood, what the world is like, he's been a businessman. And so I've seen him be entrepreneurial in his approach to try and solve, business problems for other businesses, for his own business. And so in a way, I've always been in a place where intellectual curiosity has been encouraged, but also it's towards solving a problem, towards understanding how to make things better. And I grew up in sort of an idyllic place in India. It's a very beautiful place, Nasik. It's surrounded by hills, river. Now, especially in the last 20 years, there's been a wine industry that's grown up, so there are vineyards around. And so love of nature was another thing that both my dad and I shared growing up. So, yeah.
Sounds amazing. My wife's been in Mumbai, but I have not had the pleasure, so I'm hoping to fix that soon, and I will definitely check out the local vineyard to see what that tastes like. But did you always know, you inherited this love of nature, your love of problem solving, or looking at people who are solving problems. Did you always know that you wanted to be a scientist? Because, of course, you got a PhD in organic chemistry from Oxford, which also stands you apart from many other people, hacks in the trade like myself. So you're a little more qualified to talk about some of this stuff than most. But did you always know you wanted to be in the sciences?
Not really. I mean, growing up, there was perhaps one PhD in my entire extended family. And, extended families in India can be very large. And, I'd met him once or twice, but it wasn't sort of like he was the inspiration after which I was going. I really did not know what scientists did or, what it could be to be a scientist. It's really during my undergrad where there was clearly interest from the professors who were teaching us to do research. Again, over here in Western universities, that's pretty normal, where you have teachers who are professors, but also people who are doing research and have their own labs. It's not so common in Indian engineering schools, for example.
Right.
It's mostly professors just teaching, very rarely doing research. But I happened to go to the Institute of Chemical Technology, where research was encouraged. And we saw a lot of the seniors who were graduating going to MIT, Harvard, to Berkeley. And so that sort of was the inspiration to be curious about the world and to think that actually you can do research and you can make money doing research, because that is something that parents were absolutely clear. You're not going to go and do a PhD if you're not going to make money.
Right.
So that's how I got into doing research in the first place.
So this perhaps a different question, which is, so you got your PhD, right? Prestigious university. You could have walked into a job in big pharma, presumably a very well-paid job. Instead, you went the route of journalism. What did your dad and mom say when you told them that's what you were going to do?
I think they'd had enough of a shock the first time around that he's going to go and do a PhD. Well, we don't know what that's like. And, fine, it's Oxford, so maybe he'll figure it out.
Right.
That when I came around and I said second time, I want to do journalism, and we didn't know any journalists. I hadn't grown up with journalists around me. I just did not know anybody. And they were like, well, you've done your PhD now. As long as you can promise us you'll make some money, fine.
As long as the checks don't have to keep being sent, then at some point,
Yes.
yeah, no, I understand. That's still, I think, a conversation that many people wish that went as well with their parents on
Yeah.
various times in their life. So that sounds terrific.
Well, they just wanted to be sure I can stand on my 2 feet,
Well, you seem to have done a little better than that. So, I think their bet is paid off. One of the other things that makes your work stand out, and thank you for sharing some of that background, is I think it's rooted in a sense of empathy that I find to be fairly rare in science and tech reporting. You write quite movingly about the benefits that many Indian farmers get from the solar revolution, and you cite a study reporting that at least 60,000 Indian farmers have killed themselves because of climate change affecting their ability to make a living. How important was that background in enabling you to write this book as opposed to a different type of book?
Well, it sometimes helps to come to journalism from a different background. I think journalism is one place where you ideally want it to be a reflection of society. You want a reflection of what's happening in the world. You don't just want journalists who chase a political story and who just want to see one person winning over the other as the only story to be chased. And so when I came into journalism from a science background, from somebody who'd grown up in India, to me, it was obvious that there are all these benefits that come from technology, from science, that do make people's lives better, while also being hyper aware that that does not mean there's progress that sorted all our problems. I still see poverty in India whenever I go home, but I saw a lot of it when I was growing up. And so you have to live in this sort of two-track world where progress is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. And that is how you think about climate as well. So to me, it wasn't unnatural to think about what's happening in climate. People are sometimes shocked. They're like, well, we've known about this problem for 30 years. How have we done nothing? Well, we have not done nothing. We have done a lot, just not enough to actually tackle the problem. The other thing is, growing up in India, it is just true as a developing country. Problems are everywhere around you. And you can sit and talk about problems day in and day out, and you can find many of them. But the only way progress happens is to find out what you can do about them. And so I've always had that as sort of the driving principle for my journalism, which is, as a journalist, I provide society service through pointing to the problems. But I think we also should provide society service through pointing to solutions and how those solutions came by and what are the problems with those solutions, because everything has trade-offs, whether it's a solution that works perfectly well as it seems, or a solution that is not working, but we would like it to work.
Right. I think it was I'm actually going to take a quick sip of water. I think it was a conversation that you were having with Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction author, but I think the question that I think you'd posed was, to some extent, doing this stuff is more than just the job. There's a certain aspect of it. It's a calling. And how do you see your role? You've explained a lot about how you see it as a journalist. But do you see that doing journalism about climate and solutions in climate is, as you say, it's different from political reporting of just saying, red versus blue and who's up, who's down, and having the scorecard. How do you see journalism as, what you're doing, this flavor of it, and how it's different?
Yeah.
And why is that important?
Well, I think, there is that saying, which is you can't convince somebody to agree with your point of view if their paycheck depends on it. And I would say, we use that to make fun of people who are clearly biased towards a certain point of view because they are getting paid by, say, the fossil fuel industry or whatever. But, there's a flip side of it, which is we assume people always choose a certain profession because they want to do it. And once they choose that profession, it's because they are calling for it. But look, I'm a journalist. I didn't know I would be a journalist. Growing up, I didn't know I would do journalism. It happened to be the thing that was interesting. And I found somebody who wanted to pay me money to keep doing it. And I enjoy it. But as a journalist, that is what I am doing now. I am looking at the world. I'm trying to see how it works and trying to find what is interesting and what is changing and what are the problems and what are the solutions. If I were working in a climate startup and I was betting on one technology and how to make it work, I would put all my mind and focus on that. But as a journalist, my mind and focus is on very much telling the world how to think about this problem. So I don't know about the calling side. I do enjoy it. And as long as I can enjoy doing the work while I'm getting paid for doing it and I do it well, that's good enough for me.
Fair enough. So you made this move in terms of your reporting at Quartz to start covering climate and inspired, according you relay in the book, after being asked to look at the candidate Trump, as was, and his description of clean coal, which I thought was I'd forgotten, and that's kind of
that's
started
going to
your
come
journey.
Back at some point. I feel like this year,
Possibly sooner rather than later. I wonder if in the debates in June this will start coming up. Something we're all looking forward to, I'm sure. But I suppose how that pushed you in this direction. I mean, I guess actually I'll take one other question here, which is, so you started this by covering that rather hilarious idea that for clean coal, Donald Trump meant coal you put through a washing machine or something. You were raised in India. You live in the UK. Which country is most insane when it comes to climate?
Oh, insane. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. I don't know if there is a way to characterize a country that way because, is it the action of the country that you can characterize? Is the action of some people in the country choosing a particular direction? Is there a little bit of inevitability to this, right? Like in India, you want energy right now and you want energy as cheap as possible because that's going to help you grow your economy, help you provide services to society as they want it, demand it. My grandpa, who's lived in India for 91 years of his life, never had any air conditioning at home. And this is the first summer where he said, I think it's time. I do actually need air conditioning.
Wow.
The things are getting hotter and he needs air conditioning. We can afford it, thankfully. So he's now got air conditioning. That means his energy use is going to go up for the first time in a long time. But that's what's going to happen. So there's a little bit of inevitability to it, right? Which is that India is using so much coal because it needs more energy. So I don't know if there is a country that is insane. I would say there are, if anything, on the flip side, countries that are being insane about losing the opportunity that this presents, right? So I had Chris Skidmore at the Climate Impact Summit, and then as a guest on the Zero podcast that I host. And he basically said that, look, what the conservatives are doing right now is missing out on opportunity for the country to progress in the 21st century on future technologies, on future businesses that will be profitable and will make jobs happen in this country if you don't grab on it. So I don't know who's being insane on climate. I suppose it's whether the leadership of a country is not choosing
Right.
to either act rationally in the moment that we live.
Well, as a Yank, I'm going to vote entirely for the states being the absolutely most batshit crazy insane. So I'm going to go with that one. So you can choose to agree or disagree. But
But
that's
I would say, I mean, the insanity is,
It's a loaded term. It was
It's a loaded
deliberately a
term.
loaded
But
term.
also, I feel like you could imagine a bunch of climate startups that exist today would not have existed without being a little bit insane. That you're making a bet that something will become real and that people will pay for it and that you'll actually make money out of it. Like that is to some extent insane.
Well, that's fair. That's a fair point. But I suppose I was going to ask as well what the reception to the book has been in the U.S. You launched here in the U.K., then you released an edition into the States, and you've been doing a little bit of a book tour and doing events. What's the difference? How have you found the reception there versus here?
Weirdly, I found more of a attack on capitalism in America than I found it here in the UK.
Interesting.
And I think because there's just the ideological divide that is much stronger in the US than it is here in Europe. And I've been fortunate to be able to take the book not just here in the UK, but to a bunch of European cities. And I've done an East Coast tour of the US. I'm going to do one on the West Coast eventually. So, that to me was a little bit surprising, but I also ended up in places where I've been speaking to lots of different audiences. So within universities, I've sometimes been at the engineering school or sometimes at the business school or sometimes at the environment school. And the sets of questions I get are very different because that's the context in which they are living. But I've also taken it to companies, to investment firms, to think tanks, to not-for-profits. Very different questions. But what I've all through this have found very interesting is that people actually have a much more sophisticated understanding of both the climate problem but also the solutions ahead. And I think most people are not trying to be ideological in any direction on business. They are more practical about, so how can I make this particular thing I feel is the solution work?
Right. And I think that's we'll come back. I'll be rattling that around my brain about how the reaction of the U.S. has been more ideological and anti-capitalist than over here, but we'll leave that aside.
I think that makes sense to me to some extent, which is there is clearly, I mean, in the U.S., capitalism is a lot more freer. We can never say it's free market, but it's a lot more freer. And the politics on climate is very clearly divided. And so you get a very edgy situation happening, which is less so in Europe, and that's understandable.
Right. So more of a safe space. If you're discussing it here in the States, you're kind of actually more there. You're kind of welcoming the fact that you're in a tribe. If you're discussing it, if you care about the issue, you're probably of like-minded people around you at a book event.
Yes, but also, again, like lots of places where there was a lot more push towards capitalism, against capitalism, that, well, how's it working out for America? Look at our healthcare system. And it's true, it's a problem. But I think the difficulty is trying to apply. I feel like with the book, because it's got capitalism in the title, people love capital, but capitalism, everybody has some sort of complaint they want to hang on it. I think there is just a lack of understanding on the very obvious definition of capitalism at the simplistic level that people don't think of it. People think of all the other systems and all the other problems that happen in the system as a problem of capitalism. And so, it's been fun to try and disentangle that.
I suppose one of the things I think the book has been so well received, and certainly the people I've given it to, I've given away many copies at this point. Universally, they come back saying, thank you, this has been great. Thanks for this good read. But one of the things that's so refreshing is it's not the usual suspects. I mean, you set up a bunch of archetypes and you set up different characters in the book, and you've spent years collecting these conversations in order to be able to put together these chapters. But you have to go quite deep into the book before you get to a character that many readers would already have been familiar with, and also that you have to get pretty deep in the book before you have someone who's based in the US or UK, which I also found a very interesting choice. Tell us about that. Why is Wan Gong the first character you profile in the book?
Well, again, just coming from where I come from in India and seeing that, the climate solution challenge is a bigger challenge for developing countries than it is for developed countries, but also to try and address, which is sort of still an undercurrent in climate conversations, that, oh, but look at India and China, they're not doing anything, so why should we? And I felt like that just didn't make any sense to me as somebody who's reporting on this subject and looking at how much China was doing and how much India's trying to do, that it felt right to start the book with China, then India, and then start to think about the rest of the world. Because if you can try and address the problem in China and India, you can start to address the problem everywhere, because you get to work those solutions in circumstances that are difficult to start with. But Wang Gang is just such a fascinating character, right? You know, it's communist China, but it's also state-driven capitalism China. And so you don't usually hear about characters beyond, say, Xi Jinping, who is the leader of the country. But to have this one character be sort of a driving force, to have this story of him growing up in China, but then going to Germany to study and then rise up the ranks through an auto company, and then realizing, actually, what about if we had an auto industry in the 21st century in China? It cannot be what we've had in the 20th century in Germany. And so, you know, he comes back and he makes this case to the leadership, because he's become senior by that time, is able to talk to a minister of science in the government, and says, look, we got to move away from fossil fuels because there just ain't enough in the world. And if we do, we might actually build an industry that could be an edge for us as Chinese people. They're not really thinking about climate change at this point. They're thinking about their own competitiveness, their own economy.
Right.
That's fair enough. And he comes back and he's able to showcase that at the Beijing Olympics through sort of 100 electric cars and a few buses that ferry the athletes around. But all the time, pollution is going up, oil consumption is going up, and you've got this problem that he anticipated proving out to be true. And so the Chinese government then looks at his work and says, well, why don't you try it at a bigger scale?
Right.
Can you make an industry out of it? And, you know, he succeeds. But it's not like him alone as a government bureaucrat setting up each company and making each person in the company do their thing. The capitalism part of it is that they created the rules, they created the market, and then private capital came. Even from America, right? Warren Buffett is one of the biggest shareholders in BYD, the world's largest electric car maker that is Chinese.
And I think that's something that, you know, we saw some news flow on that this week about how another electric car company, Tesla, their chief executive seems to have had a bit of some sort of episode where he's decided to ditch the Model 2.
Well, it's this week, last month, you know.
I know, but I think like hearing some of the reporting.
An episode with the CEO of Tesla is a recurring daily episode, I feel like.
I think there could be a really good sitcom you could probably do with that. Anyway, if anyone's listening, I'm sure we can work on get consultants to help write that. But anyway, I think that, you know, when they ditch the Model 2, which they're talking about, and they're going to go whole in on AI and robotaxi. And some of the reporting from the engineering and design folks who came to Tesla to work in purposeful stuff, not just on making a cool car, although that's important, but also on climate. And then they find that actually, now, bro, I mean, like, now you want to do this thing with AI and robot, what? Why are we? And thus perhaps leaving the market open for BYD to really flood is the wrong word. That's a negative word. Let me rephrase. To succeed, because the field has been left open for them to provide the most affordable electric cars that most people will be able to get inside of in the next 20 years in most markets around the world. I guess the question is whether or not you can be too successful and whether or not the backlash might happen from that.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like if we start going down the Tesla route, we'll just spend the entire conversation talking about all the problems with Tesla. I mean, look, Tesla was a service to society in that it showed something was possible in electric cars that is cool, effective, works, and is a commercial enterprise that you can make profit of. That is a service to society that Elon Musk has provided. But, you know, it's one car company. We are 2-3% in the entire stock of cars that is electric. There's a 97% market that needs to be turned over. And Tesla is not going to be the company that's going to have, any more than 5-10% of that market. So 90% is still to play for. And there are all these other people who can look at what Tesla's done and try and make a dent into this market. And that's the joy of capitalism, if there is one, which is you get competition. People who make poor bets lose out.
Well, I think we've good enough airtime to Tesla. I agree with you entirely. Certainly, you deliberately chose to do less of that in the book. Another profile that you give as a framing device telling the story is Vicky Holub at Occidental, or Oxy. And when you and I first met, I think I asked an impertinent question from an audience where you were speaking, launching the book, about the role of oil companies having in climate solutions. But I was struck by your inclusion of this anecdote about Vicky Holub, and that before she committed the company to developing carbon removals solutions at scale, that she'd had a meeting with Pope Francis along with other executives. And you mentioned it a couple of times. And I'm just wondering if you can unpack that a little bit about, do you think that had a significant influence on her deciding to do this, or was it just a coincidence?
Well, it might have been a coincidence. It might have been a significant impact. I don't know for sure because she didn't tell me. I couldn't ask her that question. What I do know is that it is certainly a coincidence because she visited the Pope and then eventually had this climate plan for the company, and that climate plan involved doubling down on carbon removal technology as sort of becoming a carbon management company. No, I mean, I don't know. But to me, it is interesting. When you put characters in the book, you want to explain to the reader what is it that would allow you to understand their story, but you can't always be sure about the causal connections. At least, that's sort of the limitations of the reporting. If somebody doesn't want to answer a question about that, well, that's their right to.
Fair enough. I just think it was interesting, and I think we can speculate, but obviously only she knows what motivated that. But I suppose what is undeniable is the fact that they have made one of the most significant investments. And I think you've explored on various things about the enhanced oil recovery aspect of why. But I suppose the flip side of that for me is that technology has at least one off-taker so far. So if you believe that technology is going to be necessary for us to be able to achieve, reaching towards net zero, or after an overshoot coming back to a 1.5 degrees C situation, I suppose there is this weird situation where we sometimes have to make compromises with people who might not otherwise want to be in bed with.
Yeah, it's true. And there are carbon removal companies that do not want to take any oil money because oil money has been seen in the past and maybe even now as one that distracts you away from actually delivering on your goals. I will say, I think, wasn't trying to bring in religiosity to try and give a direction. But I do see from my own reporting that when the case for climate settles in, when you really appreciate the science, you understand the economics, you understand the technology, there is a conversion. I mean, Chris Skidmore is an example. He wasn't a climate guy and then he became a climate guy. Alok Sharma here in the UK, same example. You would say the CEO of the oil company in Abu Dhabi, Sultan Al Jaber, who was COP28 president, kind of a conversion story, right? So when you do appreciate how big a challenge it is, how much the world is going to change, and how much of an opportunity there is to try and make things better, it becomes a calling for many people. And so that may have been the case with Vicky Holub.
Well, I suppose if she's welcome to phone in if she'd like to tell us and fill in those details, but I think it's just interesting to speculate. So we could go through all the book, but we don't have time. I appreciate we have to get you out of here at a certain point. Couple more questions before we ask you, as we do all our guests, in an homage to Ezra Klein, to give us 3 sources of inspiration that you've had in the past, whether it be books, films, etc. But before we get there, so obviously we would all love our children equally. And so each chapter, each story that you're telling is, of course, I'm not going to ask you which your favorite was, but I suppose, what were the ones who just didn't make the cut? And maybe it was your editor's choice rather than you. But obviously there's only so much space in the book. There are some stories you might have wanted to tell, but just didn't fit.
Yeah.
What are one or two that you would want to have included?
Yeah, it was more timing than trying to figure out whether the story could fit. So one, I would have really liked to have a chapter on lab-grown meat, but just the technology hadn't scaled up. There were a bunch of startups that are doing things, but it just didn't feel like that technology is ready for prime time. And so, maybe in the future. But I was also thinking about a chapter on methane emissions and the people trying to tackle it. But sort of having an individual story there didn't feel right. There was just not enough of a character to be able to hold through what is, abstract, invisible, gas, but very important. So there were a few things that, would have been nice to have maybe had some more time to think through. I'm sure if I had think through harder, I would have landed how to do that story. But yeah, deadlines. It's sometimes useful for a journalist to have them.
Well, eventually it has to stop, so that is important. And we are rapidly heading towards that moment, so I'm not going to keep you forever. I guess, what was adaptation something you considered including in greater depth in terms of that we're now seeing more discussion around adaptation technologies, whether they're investable, if they are, by whom, with what rate of return should be expected, etc.?
No, I didn't, and I did not have a better answer previously when I was writing the book, apart from saying I want to focus on trying to reduce emissions because there is clearly a set of technologies and there's a clear set of business case that enables mitigation to happen. Adaptation is a different challenge, and right now also there are not that many solutions that are scaling. Many of these solutions can never work globally everywhere. They'll be very local, and so it's a harder challenge to tell as a story. But having written the book, and since then, my understanding of climate finance has been getting better, and I think that was the right bet, because it is just fundamentally true that, if you think about what money it's going to take to solve the climate problem, there's money to be made in reducing emissions. So most of your money should go there, and justifiably so, because you want to reduce emissions fast, because if you do that, then the rest of the problem becomes easier. Right. Adaptation is one that will sadly be required a lot more governments to be involved. So you'll have to borrow from the future in some form. And yes, corporations can do that to some extent, but they're not willingly going to do it. So it's going to be governments that will have to do that. And right now, the political case for it is getting stronger, but the political financial case for governments to act is not. So there's not enough adaptation happening, and that's a big problem. And there's, rightly so, lots of activist pressure to focus on the adaptation problem. And then there's the loss and damage side, which is compensation, where rich countries just have to pay poor countries to deal with the damages that are caused, which ideally should be the smallest bucket. But if you don't do the first two, then that becomes the biggest bucket. So it is good. I feel like, at least from a book, it could be a 600-page book and solve all problems maybe, but for a 300-page book, that is what I could focus on.
Fair enough. And I think people have really enjoyed all the stories that you did tell, so that's fair enough. And then finally, before we go to those recommendations, I think I shared with you earlier this research that came out from YouGov polling that the Tony Blair Institute had commissioned earlier this week. So to your point about the importance of audiences, particularly in democratic countries, having a better understanding of how much progress is being made in places like India and China. Question that voters are asked is, do you believe that we are likely in this country or in the EU, or that countries like China are likely to make their climate targets? And if not, then there tends to be correlated with a view that, therefore, I'm not willing to make sacrifices on behalf of making that future happen. Yeah. So did you have? Again, I appreciate this may be a bit unfair, but it has been in the news for a couple of days. Any take on that? And
I would say
your work might be relevant for that.
Yeah. So the surveys are very interesting, but they're a snapshot of a very specific methodology that's been used. They are going after a certain number of people, certain places. They're a useful signal, but I wouldn't take them as very determinative of how things stand. But that was a very interesting piece of work. It broadly tells you that net zero is something people want, right? Not just that people care about wanting to work on climate change, but very specifically, they actually want countries to commit to net zero. 65%, I think that was the figure, both in the UK and the EU. at least in the countries that they surveyed. And so there's clearly policy support available if politicians would like that to tap into it. And clearly the Conservatives don't want to, and Labour seems to be kind of, thinking about it. So that's the UK situation. I found that very useful. The second thing I found very useful was that, yes, there was a China question in there, which was interesting. I would say, if I were to do a methodology on that survey, I would say, do you think the US is doing enough on climate? And if so, do you think it's doing more than China? Just because its emissions are falling as a rich country with historical emissions that are cumulatively more than China's, the US is still far behind. The Inflation Reduction Act brings it into current conversation, but from an emissions perspective, a long way to go for the largest producer of oil and gas. So you could have asked that question of them and say, would the US meet its net zero target? If not, would you support the UK continuing its net zero journey? So I don't think the China question, to me, gave me any more insight. Of course, if you are seeing a large economy not doing its job, you as a small economy would be like, well, shouldn't they do their job? Yes, but that should be true for both US and China, and I didn't see that question. The third thing that I found most interesting in there was the question on stories about climate technologies and how those stories are actually more convincing of the people who are doubtful of climate action, who are doubtful of our ability to achieve it. And I thought, to me, that's kind of justifying the work I do, which is great to have, some data point that says, keep doing more of that. But that, to me, felt like a really nice confirmation of at least what I see in the audiences that that I'm able to reach through my work.
Well, that was my gift to you, just to end on a happy note before we talk. Like, we want to ask, as we do all our guests, for what we call catalysts. So everyone's going to have a cheesy name for this segment of the show. 3 things that you had read or listened to or watched or experienced that shaped your point of view on climate and climate tech.
Yeah, I would say the book is The Great Derangement. It's by Amitav Ghosh. He's a fiction writer, first and foremost, but has written a number of nonfiction books and very closely, almost always has had some form of climate theme in it or some form of like inequality, colonialism, and he blends those themes so well, and he does historical work that is fantastic. But in The Great Derangement, he makes this case that not enough fiction writers, authors, script writers think about climate change as an everyday lived experience. There is climate fiction, and you get things like the Geostorm or these movies, but,
Termination Shock.
Yeah, exactly. But you don't get everyday climate change playing back in the background and having an impact on people's life. He does that job really well. I would say another book that I would recommend on this would be, if you just wanted to get like a very clear, simple primer of where we are on the problem, just sort of like the science of it. Now I'm going to get the title wrong, but The Best of Times, The Worst of Times is what it's called. And it just gives you this sort of like two world view, which is like, if we did the things that we want to on climate, the world actually gets better. You don't just try and tackle the climate problem. The solutions actually make the world better. Right. And if we don't, then it's, climate starts to make other things really bad. So we really are in this very powerful position in this decade, in this generation, to actually determine which path we want, humanity over the next hundreds or thousands of years experiencing the world. And then the final one I would say is I recently watched this movie called The Current War. And it's about Westinghouse and Edison and the fight that they had in the late 19th century to try and figure out which kind of power is it, direct current or alternating current. But, the current war is what it really is at the heart of it. But it's the entrepreneurial spirit that drives them in that like 19th century world where having access to energy and actually making people's lives better, and you could see those impacts in front of your eyes, to me was a very well told story. It's cinematically really beautiful, and I feel like electricity is something I'm obsessing about right now, and so I was watching it as part of my sort of obsession. But I think a lot of us should be obsessed with electricity because more and more of our lives are becoming electrified, and that's going to be a key climate solution.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Cumberbatch's performance in that is he gets these characters, right? He's able to get inside the head of pretty quirky characters that might otherwise not be particularly relatable. But look, we could go on. You have other things you have to do. Akshat Rathi, noted author, rival podcaster, Bloomberg journalist. Before we let you go, what's next? Are we going to do another book?
Well, we'll see. I mean, the book is a long time effort, so I feel like let me accumulate more of my journalism and see where I land. But right now, I'm just excited to, keep writing about solutions and to find new technologies that work and that don't work, and to dig deeper on finance, because I feel like that's the bottleneck that needs to be really sorted. But it's sort of a dry subject that nobody really wants to think about, but I want to make it fun.
Well, okay. Well, we'll leave it there. Akshat Rathi, thank you so much for joining us on Wicked Problems.
Thank you for having me. This is really fun.
Thanks to my guest Akshat Rathi for joining us for our 50th episode. I can't really believe it myself. Thanks for coming along this crazy ride. Check out wickedprobs.earth to get all the good stuff. And if you haven't bought at least 2 copies of Akshat's book, this is your chance to fix that. You'll find a link in the show notes. So, see you soon.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech. The place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.